Daniel Brooks, a retired police officer with a body that no longer moved the way it once did, rolled slowly into the Cedar Falls animal shelter. He wasn't there looking for a miracle. He just wanted something, anything, to break the silence that had taken over his life. But when he reached the last kennel at the end of the hallway, everything stopped. Curled in the shadows was a German shepherd, thin, scarred, and barely moving. Then, slowly, the dog lifted its head, and Daniel's breath caught in his chest. It was Rex, his canine partner. The dog he had lost 3 years ago during a mission that destroyed everything. How had Rex survived all this time? And why had he been waiting here? Broken, forgotten, until now. What happened next would not only change Daniel's life forever, but prove that some bonds are stronger than time, pain, and even death itself. The metal gate of the Cedar Falls animal shelter creaked softly as Daniel Brooks pushed himself back out into the gray afternoon. The sky hung low, thick with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered, as if the town itself had forgotten how to release what it carried. Daniel paused at the top of the short ramp, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. For a moment, he didn't move. He was 39, though the years had settled on him unevenly. His once athletic frame was still broad through the shoulders, but thinner now, as if something inside him had been quietly hollowed out. His dark brown hair, cut short and practical, showed faint streaks of gray at the temples. A faint scar ran along his jawline, barely noticeable unless the light caught it just right. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Steel gray, distant, always scanning, yet never quite present. 3 years ago, Daniel had been one of the most respected canine officers in Cedar Falls. Calm under pressure. Relentless when it mattered. The kind of man rookies watched and tried to imitate. Then came the warehouse raid. The explosion had taken more than just his mobility. It had taken his partner, his purpose, and something deeper he never found the words to name. Official reports called it a line-of-duty injury. Therapists called it trauma. Daniel simply called it silence. He exhaled slowly and rolled forward. Behind him, inside the shelter, Rex was being prepared for release. The staff had insisted on paperwork, protocols, a dozen small steps that felt absurdly trivial compared to what had just happened. Daniel didn't argue. He rarely argued anymore. He just waited. Cedar Falls stretched quietly around him as he made his way toward his truck, a faded blue pickup modified with a ramp and hand controls. The streets were clean but worn, lined with oak trees whose leaves whispered faintly in the wind. It was the kind of town where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen, and yet everything had. As Daniel reached the truck, the shelter doors opened again. A young woman stepped out, holding a leash with careful, measured tension. "Easy, Rex, easy," she murmured. Her name was Emily Carter, 32, the shelter's lead veterinary assistant. She had a slim build, practical posture, and chestnut brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. Her green eyes were steady, observant, the kind of eyes that had learned patience from years of working with broken animals. She moved with quiet confidence, but there was caution in the way she handled Rex, a respect for the damage he carried. Rex followed slowly. Up close, the damage was undeniable. His once sleek coat was patchy, marked with scars that told stories no one had heard. One ear bore a jagged tear. His gait was uneven, favoring a hind leg that had never fully healed. But despite everything, there was still something unmistakable in the way he moved. Disciplined, alert, watching. A soldier, even now. When Rex saw Daniel, he stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just stopped. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped forward and positioned himself beside Daniel's chair, on the right side, exactly where he used to be. Daniel's throat tightened. Emily noticed immediately. "He's already falling into position," she said softly, almost to herself. "That's not something we trained here." Daniel gave a faint nod. "You didn't have to." Emily studied him for a moment, then offered a small, understanding smile. "He'll need time and care. He's been through more than most dogs I've seen." Daniel glanced down at Rex. "So have I." For a brief second, their eyes met, not as strangers, but as two people who understood something without needing to explain it. Emily handed over the leash. "If anything feels off, you call me, day or night." "I will," Daniel said, though his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who rarely asked for help. She hesitated, then added gently, "He's lucky you came back for him." Daniel didn't respond right away. His gaze remained on Rex. "No," he said finally. "I think I'm the lucky one." The drive home was quiet. Rex lay in the passenger seat, his head resting on the worn fabric, eyes half closed, but never fully asleep. Every so often, he glanced at Daniel as if confirming that this was real, that he hadn't been left behind again. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but his mind drifted. Memories surfaced in fragments, footsteps echoing through dark alleys, Rex's bark cutting through silence, the weight of certainty when his partner was beside him. And then the fire, the noise, the moment everything disappeared. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Not today," he muttered under his breath. The truck turned onto Maple Street, where Daniel's small house sat at the far end. It was modest, a single-story structure with peeling paint and a fence that leaned slightly to one side. It wasn't much, but it was his. More importantly, it was quiet. Too quiet. As the truck rolled to a stop, Rex lifted his head. Across the street, a boy stood frozen mid-step, staring. He couldn't have been more than 10. This was Jake Miller. Jake was small for his age, with messy blonde hair that never seemed to stay in place and bright blue eyes that carried more curiosity than fear. He wore a worn-out hoodie 2 sizes too big and sneakers that had seen better days. There was a restless energy about him, the kind that came from growing up too fast. He lived with his mother, Sarah Miller, a waitress at the local diner who worked double shifts more often than not. Since his father's death 2 years earlier, Jake had learned to fill the silence in his own way, wandering, watching, imagining, and lately, watching Daniel. Jake had seen the man in the wheelchair many times, always alone, always quiet, a figure that seemed carved out of something harder than everyone else. But this was different. "That's a police dog," Jake whispered to himself. Rex stepped down from the truck slowly, his movements careful but controlled. His eyes flicked toward the boy, sharp and assessing. Daniel noticed immediately. "Easy," he said quietly. Rex stilled, though the tension remained in his posture. Jake took a hesitant step forward. "Is he friendly?" the boy asked, his voice carrying a mix of awe and caution. Daniel studied him for a moment. "He's learning," he replied. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Jake nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "He looks like a hero." Daniel let out a faint breath, something between a laugh and something else. "Yeah," he said. "He is." From the doorway across the street, a voice called out, "Jake!" Sarah Miller stood there, arms crossed, her expression tight with concern. She was in her early 30s, with tired eyes and dark hair pulled back hastily. Life hadn't been easy on her, but she carried herself with quiet resilience. "Come back inside," she added, glancing briefly at Rex. Jake hesitated, then backed away slowly. "Can I come say hi sometime?" he asked. Daniel looked at Rex, then back at the boy. "Maybe," he said. Jake grinned, then ran back across the street. As the door to Daniel's house closed behind them, the world seemed to settle into silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. Rex moved cautiously through the living room, sniffing, mapping the space. Then, without hesitation, he returned to Daniel's side and lay down beside the chair, right where he belonged. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's head. The house was still quiet, but for the first time in 3 years, it didn't feel like darkness anymore. The memory of that moment refused to leave Daniel Brooks. Even as the quiet of his house settled around him the night before, even as Rex's steady breathing filled the empty spaces that once felt unbearable, Daniel's mind kept drifting back, to the shelter, to that final kennel, to the exact second his past collided with his present. It replayed, not like a memory, but like something unfinished, something that still demanded to be understood. Because finding Rex hadn't felt like coincidence. It felt like something waiting to happen. Earlier that same day, before Rex stepped out of the shadows and back into his life, Daniel had hesitated outside the Cedar Falls animal shelter longer than he would ever admit. The building itself was nothing remarkable. Low brick walls faded by years of sun, a flickering sign that hummed faintly above the entrance, and a narrow row of windows clouded by condensation. But to Daniel, it might as well have been a threshold between two versions of himself, the man he used to be and the man he had become. He sat in his truck for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar even to him. The same broad shoulders, the same sharp jaw, but dulled, slower, as if time had pressed him down instead of shaping him. He hadn't come looking for Rex, not consciously. He told himself that over and over. This was just another step in therapy, another suggestion from Dr. Wallace, a calm, methodical man in his late 50s with thinning silver hair and wire-framed glasses, who had spent most of his career helping veterans and officers rebuild their lives after trauma. Wallace had a way of speaking that made everything sound simple, even when it wasn't. "You don't need to replace what you lost, Daniel," he had said during their last session. "You just need something to remind you that you're still here." At the time, Daniel had nodded, but he hadn't believed it. Now, sitting outside the shelter, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. Eventually, he pushed the door open and rolled himself out. The smell hit him first as he entered. Cleaning chemicals mixed with damp fur, a scent he hadn't realized he missed until it wrapped around him like a ghost from his past. The front desk was manned by a young volunteer, a teenage girl named Lily Harper. She was about 17, with curly red hair pulled into a loose bun and freckles scattered across her cheeks. Her posture was slightly awkward, as if she wasn't used to speaking to strangers. But her smile was genuine, warm in a way that made people feel immediately less like outsiders. "Hi there," she said, brushing her hands nervously against her jeans. "First time here?" Daniel gave a short nod. "Just looking." Lily didn't press. She gestured down the hallway. You can take your time. Most of them are pretty eager to meet someone. The corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with kennels on both sides. Dogs barked, paws scraped against metal bars, tails wagged wildly at the sight of someone new. The energy was overwhelming, life pressing forward in every direction. But Daniel moved through it like a man walking through noise he couldn't quite hear. He didn't stop at the eager ones, didn't reach out to the ones that begged for attention. His gaze drifted, unfocused, until the sounds began to blur into a dull hum. Halfway down the corridor, a voice called out from behind him. "You're skipping all the popular ones." Daniel turned slightly. A man leaned against the wall near the far end of the hall, arms crossed. This was Marcus Reed, one of the shelter's senior handlers. He was in his early 40s, tall with a solid build, dark skin, and a shaved head that gave him a no-nonsense appearance. His expression, however, carried a quiet patience. Marcus had spent years working with difficult animals. Rescues, strays, cases no one else wanted. It had made him observant and a little guarded. "They're not what I'm here for," Daniel replied. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you here for?" Daniel didn't answer, because he didn't know. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod toward the end of the corridor. "Last kennel," he said. "That's where the ones nobody wants end up." There was no judgment in his voice, just fact. Daniel moved again, slower this time. The barking faded the further he went, replaced by something heavier. Stillness. The last kennel sat in the corner, partially shadowed by a broken overhead light that flickered inconsistently. And inside was silence. At first, Daniel thought the kennel was empty. Then he saw the shape in the back, curled tightly, barely moving. A German shepherd. The dog's coat was dull, patches of fur missing where scars had taken their place. His body looked older than it should have been, ribs faintly visible beneath skin that had seen too much. One ear hung slightly lower than the other, torn at the edge. But it wasn't the injuries that caught Daniel's attention. It was the stillness. Not calm, not rest. Something else. Something like giving up. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Behind him, Marcus spoke again, quieter this time. "We found him about 3 months ago. Highway patrol called it in. Dog was limping along the roadside like he didn't care where he was going." Daniel didn't move. "Won't eat much, won't interact, doesn't respond to commands. Vet says he's physically stable, but..." Marcus shrugged. "Mentally, he's shut down." Daniel's hands gripped the wheels of his chair. Something about the way Marcus said it, shut down, echoed too closely to something inside himself. "Anyone try training him?" Daniel asked. Marcus let out a short breath. "Everyone did. Didn't matter. He doesn't trust anyone. Snaps if you get too close. Doesn't bark. Doesn't play. Just exists." There was a pause. "We've had people ask about him," Marcus added. "They take one look, then move on." Daniel rolled closer, slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The dog didn't react at first, but then, just as Daniel reached the front of the kennel, the shepherd stirred. Not much, just enough to lift his head slightly. And in that moment, their eyes met. Amber eyes. Tired, but not empty. Recognition flickered, brief, fragile, but unmistakable. Daniel's breath caught. The world narrowed to that single point. "No," he whispered. The dog's ears twitched. A low, uncertain sound escaped his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Marcus straightened behind him. "You know this dog?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His hand trembled as it moved toward the bars. Rex. The name barely left his lips, but it was enough. The shepherd's body tensed. Then, slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. Every movement looked like effort. Every step looked like it cost something. But he came forward. Marcus took a step closer, disbelief written across his face. "That's not possible." Rex reached the front of the kennel. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then he pressed his muzzle gently against the bars, directly into Daniel's outstretched hand. Daniel's chest tightened, his vision blurring as something inside him cracked open. Not pain, not exactly. Something deeper. Something that had been locked away since the day everything went wrong. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. Behind him, Marcus shook his head slowly. "That dog hasn't let anyone get within a foot of him," he said. "Not once." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, resting his forehead against the cold metal bars. "He was never just a dog," he said quietly. "He's my partner." Rex let out a soft sound, pressing closer. Not desperate, not frantic, just there, like he had been waiting. Daniel didn't realize how tightly he had been gripping the cold metal bars of the kennel until his fingers began to ache. Rex's muzzle remained pressed against his hand, warm breath steady, grounding, real. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the past 3 years had collapsed into silence, waiting for one of them to decide whether this was truly happening or just another cruel memory. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice rough but controlled. "Rex, sit." The command came instinctively, the same tone he had used hundreds of times before, firm, precise, carrying authority but never anger. For a split second, nothing happened. Then Rex's body jerked slightly, like a current had passed through him. Slowly, stiffly, he lowered himself onto his haunches. The movement was imperfect, his injured leg trembled, his posture uneven, but the intent was unmistakable. He obeyed. Daniel felt something in his chest crack open completely this time. Not pain, relief, proof. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Behind him, Marcus let out a low whistle. "I've never seen him do that," he said, stepping closer, disbelief still evident in his tone. "Not once. We tried everything, commands, conditioning, even bringing in a trainer from Dallas. Nothing worked." Daniel didn't look back. His eyes remained locked on Rex. "He wasn't ignoring you," he said quietly. "He was waiting." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Marcus shifted his weight, folding his arms again as he studied the scene with a different kind of attention now. Not skepticism anymore, but respect. "You said he's your partner," Marcus added. "You were canine?" Daniel nodded once. 10 years. He was my last assignment." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then I guess that explains it." Footsteps approached from behind, lighter, quicker. Lily had returned, her curiosity clearly getting the better of her. "What's going on?" she asked softly, peering past Marcus. When she saw Rex sitting calmly in front of Daniel, her eyes widened. "No way," she whispered. "That's the same dog?" Marcus gave a short nod. "Looks like it." Lily stepped closer, cautious but fascinated. "He never even looks at people," she said. It's like he's a completely different dog. Daniel reached through the bars again, his hands steady now. Rex leaned into the touch without hesitation, pressing his head gently against Daniel's palm. It wasn't the energetic affection of a young dog. It was slower, deliberate, almost careful, as if he was making sure this moment didn't disappear. "Open the kennel," Daniel said. Marcus hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of habit. "He's still unpredictable," he said. "We don't know how he'll react outside the cage." Daniel finally turned his head, meeting Marcus's gaze. There was no aggression in his expression, just certainty. "I do." The silence stretched for a moment. Then Marcus reached for the keys clipped to his belt. "All right," he said, "but we take it slow." The lock clicked open with a metallic snap that seemed louder than it should have been. Rex didn't move immediately. His ears flicked, his body tensing slightly as the barrier that had defined his world for months disappeared. Daniel lowered himself slightly in his chair, bringing himself closer to eye level. "Easy," he said, softer now. "Come on, partner." The word partner lingered. Rex stepped forward. One step, then another. His movements were cautious, testing, but there was no hesitation in his direction. He walked straight to Daniel and stopped beside him, again positioning himself on the right side. Perfect alignment. Muscle memory. Training etched deeper than trauma. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't believe this." Lily let out a quiet laugh, almost in disbelief. "He looks proud," she said. "Like he knows exactly where he belongs." Daniel reached down, resting his hand on Rex's head. The fur was rougher than he remembered, but the warmth was the same. "He does," Daniel replied. The tension in Rex's body eased slightly, though his posture remained alert. He wasn't relaxed, not fully, but he was present, engaged, alive in a way Marcus had never seen. "Try another command," Marcus suggested, curiosity replacing caution. Daniel nodded faintly. "Stay." Rex froze instantly. Not a muscle moved. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel, waiting. Daniel rolled his chair back a few inches, then a few more. Rex didn't follow. He held position despite the subtle tremor in his injured leg. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Come." Rex moved immediately, closing the distance and returning to position beside him. Lily covered her mouth with her hand. "That's incredible." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "That's training you don't lose," he said. "Not if it meant something." Daniel didn't respond, but his expression softened, just slightly. For the first time since entering the shelter, he didn't look like a man carrying the weight of something broken. He looked grounded. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. The world beyond the shelter continued as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But inside, something had changed. Marcus cleared his throat. "If you're serious about taking him," he said, "we'll need to start the adoption process. Medical evaluation, behavioral notes, paperwork." Daniel nodded. "I'm not leaving without him." There was no hesitation in his voice. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right, let's get it started." The sun was dipping lower by the time Daniel finally returned home. Rex lay quietly in the passenger seat during the drive, watching everything with a quiet intensity that hadn't faded. When the truck stopped, he lifted his head immediately. Across the street, Jake Miller was already there. He must have been waiting. The boy stood near the edge of the sidewalk, hands shoved into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, eyes fixed on the truck like he was watching something out of a movie. Jake hadn't moved much since yesterday, but something about him had changed. The curiosity was still there, but now it was sharper, focused. Daniel lowered the ramp and stepped out. Rex followed, slower but steady. Jake's eyes widened. "He's back," the boy said under his breath. Rex paused, his gaze flicking toward Jake. There was tension there, but not hostility, just awareness. Daniel noticed immediately. "Give him space," he said calmly. Jake nodded quickly, though he didn't step back. "He's a police dog, right?" he asked, unable to hide the excitement in his voice. Daniel glanced at Rex. "He was." Jake shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "He still is." The certainty in the boy's tone caught Daniel off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Rex shifted slightly, then did something unexpected. He took a small step toward Jake, not close enough to touch, but close enough to acknowledge him. Jake froze. Is that okay?" he asked. Daniel watched carefully. Rex's posture remained controlled. No raised hackles, no warning signs, just cautious interest. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "It's okay." Jake smiled, wide, genuine, the kind of smile that came from believing in something bigger than yourself. "He's awesome," the boy said. Daniel looked down at Rex, then back at Jake. "Yeah," he said again, softer this time. "He is." As the door closed behind them, the house felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just less empty. Rex moved through the space slowly, then returned to Daniel's side and lay down. Same position, same instinct. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head, his thoughts quieter than they had been in years. He had lost everything once, but somehow, not all of it. The first night passed more quietly than Daniel expected. Rex stayed close, never wandering far from the wheelchair, his breathing steady but light, as if sleep came to him in fragments rather than rest. Daniel didn't sleep much either, not because of fear, but because of awareness. Every small movement, every shift of Rex's body, every sound outside the house seemed sharper than before. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same vigilance he had carried for years, only now it had something to anchor to. Morning came slowly over Cedar Falls, sunlight slipping through the thin curtains and stretching across the worn wooden floor. Daniel wheeled himself into the kitchen, his movements practiced, efficient. Rex followed, slower but deliberate, each step measured as if he were relearning the world one surface at a time. Daniel filled a bowl with water and set it down. Rex approached, sniffed, then drank cautiously, never fully taking his eyes off Daniel. Trust, Daniel realized, wasn't something that returned all at once. It came in pieces. Small, quiet pieces. Later that morning, the stillness was broken by a sharp, sudden noise. A heavy thud from somewhere down the street. It was nothing unusual, just a construction crew dropping lumber or a truck hitting a loose panel. But inside the house, the reaction was immediate. Rex flinched violently. His entire body dropped low, muscles tightening, ears pinned back. A low growl escaped his throat, not aggressive, but defensive. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something that wasn't there. Daniel froze. Not because of Rex, but because the same sound had struck something inside him, too. For a split second, he wasn't in his kitchen anymore. He was back in the warehouse. Fire, heat, pressure. the deafening blast that had ripped everything apart. His grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. His breathing shortened. Rex barked once, sharp, urgent. The sound snapped Daniel back. He exhaled hard, forcing himself to focus. "Easy," he said, his voice lower now, steadier than he felt. "It's nothing. You're safe." Rex didn't calm immediately. His chest rose and fell too fast, his body still locked in tension. Daniel wheeled closer, slowly, giving the dog time to see him coming. He reached out, resting his hand firmly on Rex's shoulder. Not soft, not hesitant. Grounding. "Stay with me," he murmured. Rex's eyes shifted to him. The panic didn't disappear, but it softened. Just enough. Enough for the dog to focus on something real instead of something remembered. It took several minutes before Rex's breathing slowed, before his body eased back into something resembling calm. Daniel leaned back slightly, his own pulse still uneven. "Guess we're both still stuck in it," he muttered quietly. The rest of the day passed with that awareness lingering between them. Every sound carried weight. A car door slamming, a dog barking in the distance, even the creak of the house settling under heat. Each one tested the fragile balance they were trying to rebuild. By afternoon, Daniel had wheeled himself out onto the front porch, needing air more than anything else. Rex followed, settling beside him with his head low but alert. The neighborhood moved around them, quiet, ordinary, unaware. Across the street, Jake Miller stood again, this time closer than before. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly debating whether to approach. Up close, the boy looked even younger than Daniel had first thought. Maybe 10, maybe 11. His hoodie sleeves were too long, covering half his hands, and there was a faint bruise near his elbow, the kind that came from playing alone more than anything else. But his eyes, bright, curious, stubborn, never left Rex. "Can I come over?" Jake called out, his voice carrying both excitement and caution. Daniel hesitated, not because of Jake, but because of Rex. The dog hadn't reacted aggressively since coming home, but that didn't mean he was ready. Rex's ears flicked toward the boy. His body tensed slightly, but he didn't move away. Daniel studied him carefully. "Slow," he said finally, "and don't run." Jake nodded immediately and crossed the street, his steps measured but eager. He stopped a few feet away, crouching slightly, as if he instinctively understood how to make himself smaller, less threatening. "Hey," he said softly, holding out a hand but not moving closer. Rex watched him. The tension was there again, not fear this time, but uncertainty. The kind that came from not knowing what to expect. Daniel stayed silent. This wasn't something he could force. It had to happen on Rex's terms. Seconds stretched. Then Rex took a small step forward. Just one. His nose twitched, catching the scent of the boy. Jake didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. And that made all the difference. Rex leaned in slightly, sniffing the air around Jake's hand. Not touching, not yet, but close enough to accept his presence. Jake's face lit up, but he kept himself still. "He's checking me out," he whispered. Daniel allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Yeah," he said, "he is." Before anything more could happen, a voice cut across the moment. "Jake!" Sarah Miller stood on the porch across the street, her posture tense. She moved quickly, crossing the road with determined steps. Up close, Sarah looked worn in a way that wasn't about age. Early 30s, maybe, but the lines around her eyes suggested years of worry. Her dark hair was pulled back hastily, and her clothes carried the faint scent of the diner she worked at. Coffee, grease, long hours. She placed a hand firmly on Jake's shoulder. "I told you not to bother him," she said, her voice controlled but firm. Jake frowned. "I'm not bothering him," he protested. "The dog's nice." Sarah's gaze shifted to Rex, assessing. Not unkind, but cautious. "That's not a normal dog," she said quietly. "That's a trained police animal. You don't just walk up to something like that." Daniel met her eyes. "He's under control," he said calmly. Sarah didn't argue, but she didn't relax either. "Maybe," she replied, "but he's been through something. I can see it." Her gaze lingered on Rex's scars, on the way his body still held tension even at rest. She understood more than she let on. "Jake," she added more gently, "come on." The boy hesitated, looking back at Rex. "Can I come back later?" he asked Daniel. Daniel glanced down at Rex again. The dog had stepped back slightly, retreating into a safer distance. Not rejection, just limit. "We'll see," Daniel said. Jake nodded and allowed his mother to guide him back across the street. Sarah paused briefly before stepping onto her porch again. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said, her tone softer now. "I just have to be careful." Daniel nodded once. "I understand." She held his gaze for a second longer, then disappeared inside. The street fell quiet again. Rex shifted beside Daniel, lowering himself slowly onto the porch floor. His body still carried the weight of tension, but it was less now. Controlled. Managed. Daniel rested a hand on his back. "You did good," he said quietly. Rex's tail moved once. Small, but there. Not gone. Not broken. Just healing. And maybe, Daniel realized, so was he. By late afternoon, the sky over Cedar Falls had begun to change. What started as a dull gray blanket thickened into something heavier, darker, pressing low over the rooftops as if the air itself had weight. The wind picked up first, restless, circling through the trees, rattling loose branches against fences and siding. Daniel noticed it before he heard it. Years of training had sharpened his instincts in ways that never quite left. He sat near the window, one hand resting lightly on the arm of his chair, the other absent-mindedly brushing along Rex's back. The dog lay at his feet, head down but not fully relaxed, ears flicking at every shift in the air. "Storm's coming," Daniel murmured. Rex's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Outside, the first crack of thunder split the sky. Sharp, sudden, too close. Rex jolted upright instantly. His body stiffened, muscles locking as his gaze snapped toward the door. The low rumble that followed seemed to vibrate through the walls, through the floor, through him. Daniel inhaled slowly. "It's just weather," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. The storm built quickly after that. Rain came down in sheets, hammering against the windows, turning the quiet street into a blur of water and movement. The power flickered once, twice, then cut out completely, plunging the house into a dim orange glow from the fireplace. The sudden darkness tightened something in Daniel's chest. He wheeled himself closer to the table, reaching for his inhaler. His breathing had been uneven all afternoon, but now it was worse, shallow, strained, each breath feeling like it didn't go far enough. Rex paced, back and forth, back and forth. His nails tapped rapidly against the hardwood floor, his anxiety building with every roll of thunder. But something else had shifted too. His attention wasn't just on the storm anymore. It was on Daniel. The man's breathing, the way his chest rose too quickly, too shallowly, the way his hand trembled as he fumbled with the inhaler. Daniel pressed it down. A weak hiss. Barely anything. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. The medication was nearly empty. He tried again. Nothing useful. His chest tightened further, a dull pressure spreading across his lungs, each breath now more effort than relief. Rex stopped pacing. His ears pricked forward, his body going still in a different way now, focused. He stepped closer, nudging Daniel's arm with his nose. Daniel shook his head slightly. "I'm okay," he said, though the words came out thinner than he intended. Another crack of thunder shook the house. Rex barked, sharp, urgent. Not fear, warning. Daniel gripped the armrest of his chair, trying to steady himself. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "Easy," he managed, though the word lacked strength. Rex circled once, then moved toward the front door. He looked back at Daniel, eyes locked, waiting. When no response came, when Daniel's breathing only grew worse, something in the dog's posture changed completely. Instinct took over. Rex lunged at the door, barking again, louder this time. The latch rattled under the force. Daniel barely registered it. His vision had begun to blur at the edges, his focus narrowing. He knew what was happening. He just didn't have the strength to stop it. With one final push, Rex forced the door open. The storm rushed in immediately. Wind, rain, cold air slamming into the house. And then he was gone. Across the street, Jake Miller stood at his bedroom window, watching the storm with wide eyes. He had always liked storms. There was something exciting about them, something alive. But tonight felt different. The wind was stronger, the thunder louder. And there was a strange feeling in his chest he couldn't explain. When he saw Rex burst out of Daniel's house, soaked instantly by the rain, barking wildly as he ran across the street, Jake didn't hesitate. "Mom!" he called, already moving toward the door. Sarah Miller appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression already tense from the weather. "What is it?" "The dog," Jake said quickly. "Something's wrong." Sarah stepped closer to the window, her eyes narrowing as she watched Rex pacing frantically on their porch, barking, then turning back toward Daniel's house, then barking again. It wasn't random. It was purposeful, urgent. Sarah's instincts kicked in immediately. She had learned long ago to trust that feeling, the one that told her when something wasn't right. "Get your jacket," she said, already reaching for hers. "Stay close to me." Jake didn't argue. Within seconds they were outside, the rain hitting them hard, soaking through clothes and skin alike. Rex barked again, louder, then bolted back toward Daniel's house. "Follow him!" Jake shouted over the wind. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. They ran across the street, pushing through the storm until they reached the open door. Inside, the air felt thick, heavy with heat and silence. Daniel was slumped in his wheelchair, head tilted slightly forward, his breathing shallow and uneven. His hand still gripped the empty inhaler. "Oh my God!" Sarah rushed to him immediately, kneeling beside the chair. "Daniel, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered slightly, but his focus was distant. "Jake, call 911. she said sharply, her voice cutting through the chaos. The boy ran to the phone without hesitation, his hands shaking but determined. Rex stood beside the chair, barking once more, then lowering his head, nudging Daniel's hand. Not panicked now, present, watching, guarding. Sarah placed a hand against Daniel's chest, feeling the uneven rhythm. "Stay with me," she said firmly. "Help is coming." The minutes stretched painfully, the storm still raging outside, the sound of rain and thunder filling every gap in the silence. Jake's voice trembled as he spoke into the phone, relaying their address, his eyes never leaving the scene. Then, finally, sirens. Faint at first, then louder, cutting through the storm like a lifeline. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as the ambulance pulled up. 2 EMTs rushed inside, moving quickly, efficiently. One of them, a tall man in his 40s named Tom Jensen, had a steady presence, his movements practiced from years of emergency work. The other, Alicia Grant, younger, sharp-eyed, focused, carried the equipment without hesitation. They worked fast: oxygen mask, vitals, stabilization. Rex stepped back slightly, watching every move, his body tense but controlled. When Daniel's breathing began to ease under the oxygen, something shifted again. Not relief, not yet, but progress. Tom glanced at Sarah. "You did the right thing calling," he said. Jake shook his head, pointing to Rex. "He did," the boy said. The EMT followed his gaze, studying the dog for a brief moment. "Then he's one hell of a partner." Rex didn't react to the words. His attention remained on Daniel. As they lifted the stretcher and prepared to move him, Rex stepped forward, pressing his muzzle gently against Daniel's hand one last time. Daniel's fingers twitched slightly, barely noticeable, but there, alive. Rex stepped back as they carried him out into the storm. This time, he didn't follow. He stood in the doorway, watching until the ambulance lights disappeared into the rain. Behind him, Jake stood still, soaked, silent, his eyes fixed on the dog. Everything he thought he knew about Rex had changed. This wasn't just a trained animal. This was something else, something braver, something real. "He saved him," Jake whispered. Rex remained at the door, unmoving, waiting. The storm left Cedar Falls quieter than usual, as if the town itself needed time to breathe again. Fallen branches lined the sidewalks, puddles reflected broken pieces of sky, and the air carried that sharp, clean scent that always followed heavy rain. But inside the hospital on the edge of town, the night had not ended so gently. Daniel Brooks lay in a narrow bed beneath fluorescent lights, an oxygen line resting beneath his nose, the steady beep of a heart monitor marking each second he was still here. His face looked different in the sterile light, paler, more fragile. But there was something else there too. Awareness. He was awake. Across the room stood Sarah Miller, arms folded loosely, her posture less guarded than it had been before. She had stayed longer than she intended, partly because she needed to know he would be all right, partly because something about the night before had shifted her understanding of the man across the street. Jake sat beside her, legs swinging slightly off the edge of a plastic chair, his eyes fixed on Daniel with quiet intensity. "He's going to be okay, right?" Jake asked. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but a voice answered anyway. "He's stable," said Alicia Grant, the EMT from the night before, now out of her rain-soaked gear and wearing hospital scrubs. Up close, Alicia looked younger than her calm demeanor suggested. Mid-30s, sharp features, dark hair tied back tightly. She carried herself with a kind of practiced composure that came from seeing too many emergencies to panic at any of them. The oxygen helped. He just pushed himself too far without realizing it. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Sarah rested a hand lightly on his shoulder. "We should let him rest," she said, though her eyes lingered on Daniel a moment longer before turning away. Back on Maple Street, Rex had not moved much since the ambulance left. He had spent most of the night lying just inside the doorway, his body curled but alert, ears twitching at every passing sound. By morning, the storm had passed, but Rex remained where he was, watching, waiting. It wasn't until a familiar figure approached that he stirred. Marcus Reed stepped onto the porch, his heavy boots thudding softly against the wood. He had been called by the shelter after hearing what happened. News traveled fast in a town like Cedar Falls. "Hey, partner," Marcus said quietly, crouching slightly as he approached. Up close, his steady presence remained unchanged, but there was a new respect in his tone now. Rex lifted his head, studying him, but didn't move away. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I heard what you did." He reached out slowly, not touching, just offering presence. Rex didn't flinch. Not this time. "Looks like you proved us all wrong," Marcus added under his breath. 2 days later, Daniel returned home. Weaker, slower, but alive. The truck rolled into the driveway just after noon, the sun finally breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. Rex was already at the door when Daniel entered, his tail giving a single, restrained wag. Daniel paused just inside, taking in the familiar space. It felt different now. Not empty. Not silent in the same way. "You stayed," he said quietly. Rex stepped forward, pressing his head gently against Daniel's leg. Not excitement, not chaos, just confirmation. "Yeah," Daniel added softly. "I guess you would." Recovery was slower than Daniel liked, but he didn't fight it this time. He followed instructions, took his medication, rested when he needed to. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew he wasn't alone anymore. And Rex adjusted too. The edge in his movements softened slightly. The pacing at night decreased. The reactions to sudden sounds didn't disappear, but they shortened, controlled more quickly each time. They were learning. Together. It was late afternoon when it happened. The neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm. Quiet conversations, distant lawnmowers, the occasional car passing by. Daniel sat near the window, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beside him. Rex lay at his side, eyes half closed. Then, without warning, Rex's head snapped up. His ears pricked forward, his body going still in a way Daniel recognized instantly. Alert. Focused. "What is it?" Daniel asked, already wheeling himself closer to the window. Rex stood, moving toward the front door, his posture tight but controlled. A low growl built in his chest, not loud, but deliberate. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his phone without hesitation. "Talk to me," he murmured. Rex barked once, sharp, directional, then moved toward the back of the house. Daniel followed as quickly as he could, pushing his chair across the floor, his pulse rising. Through the back window, he saw movement. A figure, lean, hooded, climbing over the fence into the neighboring yard. Fast. Nervous. Not supposed to be there. Daniel didn't hesitate. He dialed immediately. "This is Daniel Brooks," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Possible break-in on Maple Street. My dog's got a visual." Rex barked again, louder now, his claws scratching against the door as he tracked the movement outside. A few streets away, Officer Ryan Carter picked up the call. Ryan was 28, relatively new to the force, but sharp. He had short, sandy hair, a clean-cut appearance, and the kind of restless energy that hadn't yet been worn down by years on the job. He had heard of Daniel Brooks. Everyone had. "On my way," Ryan said, already turning the cruiser. Back at the house, Rex remained locked onto the target. His body was tense, but he didn't bolt. He waited, just like he had been trained. Daniel stayed on the line, giving updates as best he could. "Suspects moving east, heading toward the Miller property." Across the street, Jake was in the yard, kicking a worn soccer ball against the fence. He didn't see the man at first, but he heard Rex. The bark was different, urgent. Jake looked up just in time to see the figure stumble over the fence. "Hey!" he shouted instinctively. The man froze, then turned, panic flashing across his face. And then, sirens. Ryan's cruiser turned the corner fast, lights cutting through the afternoon calm. The suspect bolted, but didn't make it far. Within seconds, Ryan had him pinned against the hood, hands secured behind his back. "You're done," Ryan said firmly. The street fell silent again, but this time it was different. Controlled. Resolved. Daniel exhaled slowly, lowering the phone. Rex's body relaxed just slightly, the tension easing as the threat disappeared. Across the street, Jake stood frozen, his eyes wide, not with fear, but something else. Awe. He knew, Jake whispered to himself. He knew before anyone. That night, Jake sat at his small desk, a notebook open in front of him. The house was quiet, his mother moving softly in the kitchen. But Jake didn't hear any of it. He was writing. His pencil moved quickly across the page, the words coming faster than he could think. "My hero is a dog," he wrote. He described the storm, the rescue, the way Rex had run through rain and thunder without hesitation. And now, how he had stopped a thief before anyone else even knew something was wrong. Across the street, Daniel sat on his porch, Rex lying beside him, calm, steady. "Good work today," Daniel said quietly. Rex's tail moved once. Small. Certain. Not just a survivor anymore. Not just a memory. A partner. A protector. A hero. The story didn't stay on Maple Street. In a town like Cedar Falls, nothing ever did. By the next morning, what had started as a quiet incident, a retired officer, a canine dog, and a thief caught in the dark, had already taken on a life of its own. At the diner on Main Street, conversations paused between coffee refills as people leaned closer, trading versions of what they had heard. At the gas station, a pair of mechanics debated the details over the hum of an engine. And at Cedar Falls Elementary, a single sheet of notebook paper had quietly begun its own ripple effect. Jake Miller sat at his desk, his pencil tapping nervously against the edge as his teacher stood at the front of the classroom. Mrs. Eleanor Parker was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes softened by a patient smile. She wore her dark hair in a neat bun, and her posture carried the calm authority of someone who had spent years guiding children through both lessons and life. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the paper in her hand. Jake's essay. "I'd like to read something to the class today," she said. Jake froze. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't written the essay to be shared. He had just written what he saw, what he felt. Mrs. Parker began reading. My hero is not a soldier or a firefighter. My hero is a dog. His name is Rex. The classroom fell quiet. Not the distracted quiet of children waiting for recess, but something deeper. Listening. As the words unfolded, the storm, the rescue, the way Rex had run through rain and darkness without hesitation, something shifted in the room. Even the students who usually struggled to sit still leaned forward. When she finished, Mrs. Parker lowered the paper slowly. That, she said softly, is what courage looks like. Jake stared down at his desk, his ears burning slightly, unsure of what to do with the attention. But inside, something steady took root. Pride. Not just in Rex, but in what he had witnessed. By afternoon, the story had moved beyond the school. A small article appeared online from the Cedar Falls Gazette, written by a local reporter named Ben Harlow. Ben was in his mid-30s, tall and slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he cared more about the story than appearances. His sandy hair rarely stayed in place, and his shirts were often wrinkled, but his instincts as a journalist were sharp. He had built a reputation for finding the human side of even the smallest events. The headline was simple. Former canine saves retired officer, then stops neighborhood break-in. It didn't exaggerate. It didn't need to. By the time Daniel stepped out onto his porch that evening, he could feel the difference. It wasn't obvious. No crowds, no noise. But people looked. Neighbors who once passed by with polite distance now slowed, nodding, offering small smiles. A man from 2 houses down raised a hand in greeting. A woman walking her dog paused just long enough to say, "Glad you're doing better." Daniel wasn't used to it. For years, he had lived on the edge of this community, present but separate, known but not really seen. Now, something had shifted. He rested his hands on the wheels of his chair, unsure of how to respond to the quiet recognition. Rex lay beside him, calm, steady, his presence grounding as always. "Guess you're famous now," Daniel muttered under his breath. Rex's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. Across the street, Sarah Miller stood in her doorway, watching. She had read the article that morning during a short break at the diner, her hands still smelling faintly of coffee and dish soap. At first, she had skimmed it, another small-town story, another moment that would fade. But then she saw the name. Daniel Brooks. And the dog. Rex. She read it again, more carefully this time. By the end, her expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Sarah was not someone who trusted easily. Life had taught her to measure people not by words, but by actions. Raising Jake alone after her husband's death had sharpened that instinct. She didn't have room for mistakes. But what she had seen, what Jake had seen, didn't fit into her usual expectations. She stepped off the porch slowly, crossing the street with measured steps. Daniel noticed her immediately, his posture shifting slightly. Not defensive, but aware. "Evening," he said. Sarah stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, but not so close as to intrude. Up close, the lines of fatigue in her face were clearer, the kind that came from long hours and quiet worries. But there was something else there now. Consideration. "I read the article," she said. Daniel nodded once. "Didn't know they were writing one." Sarah glanced at Rex, who lifted his head briefly before settling again. "Jake hasn't stopped talking about him," she added. Or you. Daniel exhaled lightly, not quite a laugh. Kid's got a good imagination. Sarah shook her head. No, she said firmly. He doesn't. The certainty in her tone lingered. She took a small step closer, her arms folding loosely across her chest. What happened the other night? I didn't understand it at first, she admitted. But I saw enough to know it wasn't just luck. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked down at Rex, then back at her. He's trained to respond, he said. That's all. Sarah studied him for a moment, then gave a faint, almost amused smile. You really believe that? She asked. Daniel hesitated. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the simple one didn't feel complete anymore. No, he said finally. Sarah nodded slightly, as if that was the answer she expected. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just new. Jake appeared moments later, practically bouncing across the street. Mom, you didn't tell me you were coming over, he said, slightly out of breath. He stopped when he reached Rex, his expression softening instantly. Hey, buddy, he said quietly. This time, Rex didn't tense the same way. He watched Jake approach, his body still alert but less rigid than before. Jake crouched slowly, careful, just like Daniel had shown him. Can I? He asked, glancing up. Daniel looked at Rex. The dog held still, then lowered his head slightly, not submission, but acceptance. Yeah, Daniel said. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Rex's fur. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Rex exhaled, a low, steady breath, and didn't pull away. Jake's grin spread instantly. He trusts me, he whispered. Sarah watched closely, her expression shifting again. Not worry this time. Something softer. Looks like it, she said quietly. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, observing the moment without interrupting it. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt part of something. You know, Sarah said after a moment, her tone lighter now. I make a pretty decent dinner when I'm not working double shifts. Daniel glanced at her, slightly caught off guard. Is that an invitation? He asked. She shrugged lightly. Maybe. There was a hint of a smile now, not forced, not guarded, just there. Jake looked between them, clearly picking up on something he didn't fully understand, but liked anyway. You should come, he added quickly. Rex, too. Daniel looked down at the dog, then back at Sarah. For a moment, the old instinct to decline, to stay distant, rose up. But it didn't hold the same weight it used to. Yeah, he said finally. Maybe we will. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Maple Street, the quiet between the houses felt different. Not empty, not distant. Connected. And Daniel realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Maybe healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it came like this, slow, unexpected, built through small moments that added up to something bigger. Rex shifted beside him, resting his head against Daniel's leg. Steady, certain. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like he was standing outside of life anymore. He was stepping back into it. Spring came quietly to Cedar Falls, not in a single moment, but in small changes that built over time. The air softened. The trees along Maple Street began to show hints of green. The long shadows of winter slowly gave way to light that lingered just a little longer each evening. For Daniel Brooks, the change wasn't just in the season, it was in the rhythm of his days. He no longer woke to silence that pressed in on him. There were sounds now. Rex shifting at the foot of his bed, the faint hum of the coffee maker, sometimes even the distant laughter of Jake Miller riding his bike up and down the street. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that he was no longer standing outside of life. Rex had changed too. The tension in his body hadn't disappeared completely. It probably never would. But it no longer controlled him. Loud noises still made his ears flick back, his posture tighten. But he recovered faster now. He looked to Daniel more often, grounding himself not in instinct alone, but in connection. Healing, Daniel realized, didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning how to move forward anyway. The idea came to him slowly, forming over weeks rather than all at once. It started with small observations. The way Rex responded when Jake approached, cautious at first, then calm. The way the dog mirrored Daniel's own progress, each step forward reinforcing the next. And then there were the others. The dogs still back at Cedar Falls Animal Shelter. The ones Marcus had described as unadoptable. The ones that reminded Daniel too much of what Rex had been, or what he himself had been. One afternoon, Daniel wheeled himself back into the shelter. This time there was no hesitation at the door. Rex walked beside him, steady, controlled, his presence drawing quiet attention from the staff. Marcus spotted them first. "Well, look who decided to come back," he said, a grin breaking through his usual reserved demeanor. Up close, Marcus looked less guarded than before. The lines in his face hadn't changed, but his posture had. More open, more willing to believe in something unexpected. "Didn't think I'd stay away," Daniel replied. Marcus glanced down at Rex. "Hard to argue with results like that." From the back office, Emily Carter stepped out, wiping her hands on a cloth. She paused when she saw Rex. Her green eyes softened instantly. "He looks stronger," she said. Emily had always carried herself with quiet professionalism, but there was something personal in the way she observed animals, like she saw not just their condition, but their story. Years ago, she had lost a rescue dog she'd been rehabilitating after months of effort. The dog had relapsed, panicked during a thunderstorm, and never recovered. Since then, Emily had learned to care deeply, but carefully. Rex, though, Rex was different. "He is," Daniel said simply. Emily crouched slightly, studying Rex's posture, his movement, the way he responded without being prompted. "You've been working with him," she said. "Every day," Daniel replied. There was a pause. Then Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. "I want to start something here," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Something like what?" Daniel glanced around the shelter, the kennels, the quiet corners where the more withdrawn dogs stayed. "A program," he said, "for dogs like him, ones that don't trust, ones people give up on." Emily's expression changed, curiosity mixing with something else. Hope, maybe. "Rehabilitation?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Not just training, recovery, structure, routine, something that gives them a way back." Marcus folded his arms, considering. "And you think you can do that?" he asked. Daniel looked down at Rex. The dog stood still, calm, attentive. Not perfect, not flawless, but present. "I think we can," Daniel said. The difference in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't speaking alone anymore. The program didn't start big. It began with 3 dogs. Daisy, a golden mix who flinched at sudden movement. Max, a heavy-set pit bull misunderstood more than dangerous. And Scout, a wiry terrier with too much energy and no direction. Each one carried their own version of damage. Each one required something different. Rex became the center of it all, not through commands, but through presence. He didn't force interaction. He didn't dominate. He simply existed in a way that the others began to mirror. When Rex lay down calmly, Daisy crept closer. When Rex followed Daniel's quiet commands, Max watched, then tried. Even Scout, restless and unpredictable, began to settle in Rex's presence. Jake was there almost every day. At first, he just watched, sitting cross-legged on the ground with wide eyes, absorbing everything. But over time, he started helping. Simple things, refilling water bowls, holding a leash, repeating commands Daniel taught him. "Sit," Jake said one afternoon, his voice firm but careful. Scout hesitated, then lowered himself awkwardly. Jake's face lit up. "He did it!" Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "You're getting better," he said. Jake shrugged, trying to hide his excitement. "I'm going to be a cop someday," he said. "Like you." Daniel glanced at him. "Then you better learn patience," he replied. Jake nodded seriously. "And how to work with dogs," he added. Rex's tail moved once, as if in agreement. Sarah Miller stood just outside the fence, watching. She had come by more often lately, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just checking in. Today, she leaned against the wooden post, arms loosely crossed, her expression softer than it had been weeks ago. "You've built something here," she said when Daniel wheeled closer. Daniel followed her gaze, the dogs, the movement, the quiet structure that had formed. "It's still small," he said. Sarah shook her head. "It's not about size," she replied. There was a pause. Then she added, "Jake talks about this place like it's the most important thing in his life right now." Daniel glanced toward the boy, who was laughing as Scout chased a ball for the first time without panic. "It might be," Daniel said quietly. Sarah studied him for a moment. "You've changed too," she said. Daniel didn't deny it. "So have you," he replied. A faint smile touched her lips. Not guarded, not uncertain, just real. By early summer, the program had grown. More volunteers joined. Ryan Carter stopped by on his days off, sometimes helping with setup, sometimes just observing. He still carried that restless energy, but it had softened slightly, shaped by experience. "Never thought I'd see a canine teaching other dogs," he said one afternoon. "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. Emily continued to assist, her confidence growing with each success. Even Marcus, who had once doubted the idea, found himself recommending dogs for the program. The shelter felt different now. Less like a place of waiting, more like a place of change. And at the center of it all was Rex. He moved slower than he once had. His scars hadn't disappeared. But his presence carried something stronger than either of those things. Purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, Daniel sat beneath a tree at the edge of the yard. Rex lay beside him, his breathing steady, his body at ease. Jake ran past, chasing Scout, laughter echoing through the space. Sarah stood nearby, talking quietly with Emily. Ryan leaned against the fence, watching it all with a thoughtful expression. Daniel rested his hand on Rex's head. "We made it," he said softly. Rex didn't respond with movement. He didn't need to. He was there. That was enough. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like a man defined by what he had lost. He felt like someone who had built something new. Not alone. Never alone again. As this story comes to an end, it reminds us of something deeper than just loyalty or courage. Sometimes, when life breaks us, when we feel lost, forgotten, or beyond repair, God is still working in ways we cannot see. Just like Rex found his way back to Daniel, maybe the things we've lost aren't truly gone. Maybe they're being guided back to us at the right moment, when we're ready to heal. So here's a question for you. Do you believe this reunion was just coincidence? Or was it God's plan all along? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear what you believe. And if you want more powerful emotional stories like this, stories about faith, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Because the next story might just change the way you see the world.